January 1st, 1991. Somewhere beneath the western Iraqi desert, engineers from the 46th Army Corps inspected reinforced concrete ceilings 20 feet thick. Soviet design specifications promised survival against anything the Americans could drop. The bunkers had been poured in layers, concrete, then steel rebar, then concrete again, following blueprints drawn up by a Yugoslav firm working from Soviet military standards. Iraqi commanders moved communications equipment, planning staffs, and leadership cadres underground with total confidence. American bombs, the biggest ones, could punch through maybe 6 feet of hardened concrete. These bunkers sat under 20. The math favored Saddam. General officers in Baghdad called them untouchable. According to a post-war Defense Intelligence Agency assessment, Iraqi military planners treated the deep command bunkers as invulnerable to conventional attack and based their entire continuity of command doctrine around that assumption. They had reason to believe it. If this story matters to you, if you served in Desert Storm, worked in defense engineering, or knew someone who did, hit subscribe and drop a comment. Your name, your unit, your role. Or write it for someone who can't. Like the video so it reaches the people who lived this. 6,000 miles west at Eglin Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle, a weapons engineer named Albert Weimorts picked up a phone call that changed the trajectory of the air war. Weimorts ran the Armament Directorate's Advanced Weapons section. He had spent years thinking about how explosives interact with concrete at high velocity, the physics of penetration, the way kinetic energy transfers through layered materials at impact speeds above 1,000 feet per second. The tasking came down informal and urgent. Air Force leadership needed a bomb capable of defeating deeply buried, hardened targets. Not 6 feet of concrete, not 10, 20 feet, minimum, with whatever lay beneath it. No weapon in the American inventory could do that. Weimorts didn't have a factory. He didn't have a production line or a 5-year development contract or a team of hundreds. What he had were surplus 8-inch artillery gun barrels sitting in Army storage depots across the country. Barrels made from high-strength steel, already machined to tight tolerances, already heat-treated, already the right general shape. Long, narrow, and almost absurdly strong. He looked at those barrels and saw something nobody else had seen. The timeline he received defied every procurement norm the Pentagon had ever established. Weeks, not months, not years. The bomb had to exist before the ground war started, and the ground war had a date circled on it already. Weimorts got to work. Colonel David Deptula pulled satellite imagery across his planning desk at the Royal Saudi Air Force headquarters in Riyadh and traced his finger along what looked like nothing. Flat desert, featureless terrain broken only by access roads that led to reinforced doors set into hillsides. The imagery analysts had flagged thermal signatures, ventilation exhaust from underground facilities running air conditioning in January. Somebody down there needed to keep electronics cool. Deptula served as the principal attack planner for the air campaign, reporting directly to Lieutenant General Chuck Horner. Every target in Iraq ran through his shop, and these bunkers represented a category of problem his shop couldn't solve. The standard American penetrator in 1991, the 2,000-pound BGU-27, carried a hardened steel casing designed to punch through roughly 6 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating its explosive fill. Against a standard Soviet-era aircraft shelter, that worked fine. Against what the Iraqis had built for their senior command infrastructure, it amounted to scratching paint. Iraqi engineers hadn't simply buried these facilities, they'd created layered defensive architectures. Earth overburden, packed 12 to 15 feet deep on top of the concrete ceiling, the concrete itself running another 11 to 20 feet depending on the site, with internal compartmentalization that could absorb a partial breach without losing the whole complex. Some facilities sat under natural rock formations with concrete liners. The hardest targets combined geology with engineering in ways that multiplied protection beyond what either provided alone. The air campaign's first 72 hours confirmed the problem in operational terms. F-111F Aardvarks dropped laser-guided penetrators on known command nodes. Bomb damage assessment photos showed craters in the overburden, scorch marks on concrete. The facilities kept transmitting. Iraqi Corps-level communications continued flowing through nodes that had absorbed direct hits from the heaviest weapons available. A British Royal Air Force liaison officer attached to the Combined Air Operations Center described the early results against the deep bunkers as rather like throwing darts at a bank vault. Accurate, but ultimately cosmetic. What made the situation operationally dangerous went beyond symbolism. Saddam Hussein's command structure depended on those bunkers functioning. Orders to Republican Guard divisions staging in southern Kuwait flowed through buried communications nodes. Air defense coordination, what remained of it after the opening strikes, ran through hardened facilities the coalition couldn't collapse. Intelligence assessments suggested Saddam himself rotated between deep bunkers on an unpredictable schedule. Killing the Iraqi command structure meant killing those bunkers. Every day they survived, Iraqi forces retained the ability to coordinate a coherent defense of Kuwait. Horner raised the problem with General Schwarzkopf. Schwarzkopf raised it with Washington. The physics of the situation came down to a simple relationship between mass, velocity, and material strength. A penetrating warhead acts like a nail driven by a hammer. The heavier the nail and the faster the swing, the deeper it goes. American bombs topped out at 2,000 pounds with casings optimized for a balance between penetration and explosive payload. Breaking through 20 feet of concrete demanded something fundamentally different. A weapon that sacrificed blast radius for raw depth. A longer, heavier, narrower body moving at terminal velocity with enough structural integrity to survive the impact without shattering. Nobody had built one before. Weimorts had the sketch on a legal pad before the phone call ended. A cylinder, roughly 19 inches in diameter, over 17 feet long, filled with 630 pounds of tritonal explosive and wrapped in a casing so thick and heavy that the complete weapon would tip the scales at 4,700 pounds. The shape alone told you everything about the design philosophy. This thing looked less like a bomb and more like a telephone pole made of steel. The gun barrels solved a problem that would have killed the project before it started. Forging a new penetrator casing from scratch meant tooling, procurement contracts, metallurgical testing, qualification rounds. Months of work compressed into a timeline measured in days. But the Army's surplus M201 barrels, pulled from 8-inch self-propelled howitzers already headed for decommissioning, arrived at Eglin pre-hardened to specifications that exceeded what any bomb casing in the inventory could match. The steel had been manufactured to contain repeated internal explosions at chamber pressures north of 40,000 pounds per square inch. A one-time impact against concrete demanded far less. Weimorts and his team of roughly a dozen engineers and machinists set up in Building 215 at the Eglin Armament Directorate, a facility that smelled like cutting oil and ozone from the arc welders running 16 hours a day. They bolted a conical steel nose piece to the forward end of each barrel, machined from a single billet of hardened tool steel. The aft end received a standard fin assembly and a laser guidance kit adapted from the Paveway 3 system, the same kit that turned dumb bombs into smart ones on every other munition in the Air Force. What made the GBU-28 different from those other munitions had nothing to do with guidance sophistication. The guidance just needed to put the weapon within a few feet of the aim point. Concrete would handle the rest. The engineering trade-offs tell you how Weimorts thought. He gave up blast radius entirely. A conventional 2,000-pound bomb spreads destruction across a wide area because its thin casing fragments into shrapnel the moment the explosive detonates. The GBU-28's casing weighed so much relative to its explosive fill that the blast effect above ground would disappoint anyone expecting a Hollywood fireball. But the weapon didn't need to impress anyone on the surface. It needed to arrive intact 20 feet below it. Testing happened at a pace that made the safety office nervous. Weimorts arranged drop tests at the Tonopah Range in Nevada, using F-111Fs flying at medium altitude. The first inert round hit a multi-layered concrete target and punched clean through, over 22 feet of penetration before coming to rest in the substrate beneath. Engineers on site felt the ground shudder under their boots from a quarter-mile away, a low-frequency pulse that traveled through desert hardpan like a small earthquake. No explosion, just raw kinetic energy dumped into stone and rebar. The second test used a live warhead. Results exceeded the design parameters. The weapon penetrated the target structure, detonated inside, and collapsed the internal volume completely. Instrumentation buried at various depths recorded overpressure waves that would have killed anyone inside the facility several times over. Weimorts called Eglin with a four-word assessment that entered laboratory folklore, though the exact phrasing varies depending on who tells it. One version, attributed to a technician present at the range, has him saying simply, "It works, send more." From legal pad sketch to functioning prototype, 17 days. From prototype to combat-ready weapons loaded onto transport aircraft bound for Saudi Arabia. 28 days total. The entire development cycle for what became the most consequential air-delivered weapon of Desert Storm fit inside a single calendar month. Pentagon acquisition programs routinely spend longer than that deciding which contractor gets to write the proposal. The guidance kit weighed 87 pounds. A small aluminum housing bolted to the nose carried a semi-active laser seeker, a set of canard fins for steering, and a computer that could process reflected laser energy into flight corrections at a rate of several hundred calculations per second. Compared to the 4,600 pounds of howitzer steel hanging behind it, the Paveway 3 assembly looked almost decorative, a delicate glass eye strapped to the forehead of a battering ram. But that eye made the difference between a very expensive hole in the wrong patch of desert and a weapon that could thread itself through a ventilation shaft opening. The Paveway 3 represented the third generation of laser-guided bomb technology, and it carried one critical advantage over its predecessors. Earlier, Paveway kits used bang-bang guidance. The canard fins deflected fully in one direction or the other, producing a flight path that wobbled toward the target like a drunk walking home. Paveway 3 used proportional guidance. The fins adjusted incrementally, smoothly, producing a glide path so stable that the weapon could be released at higher altitudes and greater standoff distances while maintaining accuracy measured in single-digit feet. For a weapon that needed to hit a specific reinforced door or ventilation opening in a hillside, proportional guidance turned a blunt instrument into a scalpel. The marriage of these two technologies, 19th century metallurgy and late Cold War precision electronics, created something the defense establishment had no category for. Existing penetrator bombs optimized for accuracy at the expense of mass. Dumb heavy bombs optimized for mass at the expense of accuracy. Weimorts fused both lines of thinking into a single airframe that gave up nothing on penetration while delivering the same terminal accuracy as the best-guided munitions in theater. Fitting the kit to the gun barrel casing required mechanical adaptation that Weimorts machinists performed by hand. The Paveway 3 had been designed for the BGU-117, a weapon with a different diameter, different weight distribution, different center of gravity. Mounting it on a cylinder nearly twice as heavy meant recalculating the aerodynamic trim of the entire assembly. The canard fins that steered a 2,000-pound bomb through its terminal dive now had to steer 4,700 pounds. Wind tunnel time didn't exist in the schedule. Weimorts engineers ran the numbers on desktop computers, adjusted fin geometry based on first principles aerodynamics, and trusted the math. The alternative, waiting for formal wind tunnel validation, meant missing the war. The F-111F crews at Taif Air Base in Saudi Arabia, who would carry these weapons into combat, had their own concerns. Each GBU-28 hung from the aircraft's internal weapons bay on modified mounting hardware, and the weight penalty changed the jet's handling characteristics in ways the flight manual didn't cover. Pilots reported a sluggishness in pitch response during pre-combat familiarization flights, a heaviness in the nose that required constant trim adjustment. The airframe groaned under loads it had never been asked to carry. One pilot from the 492nd Tactical Fighter Squadron described the sensation of rolling onto final attack, heading with a GBU-28 aboard as flying a school bus with wings. The aircraft responded to control inputs a half-beat late, as though thinking about whether it really wanted to comply. Weapon release brought its own visceral reality. When 4,700 pounds dropped free of the bomb bay at medium altitude, the F-111F lurched upward so violently that crews felt their harness straps bite into their shoulders. The jet gained several hundred feet almost instantly, like a man setting down a heavy suitcase. Pilots had to push the nose down immediately to maintain their attack profile and keep the laser designator tracking the target. The whole sequence, release, lurch, reacquire, lasted maybe 4 seconds. During those 4 seconds, the weapon fell silently toward a point of laser light dancing on Iraqi concrete, its canard fins making micro-corrections as it accelerated past the speed of sound. The seeker didn't care that the body behind it had been a howitzer barrel 6 weeks earlier. The computer didn't know it had been bolted together by a dozen machinists working double shifts in a Florida workshop. All the guidance system understood, all it needed to understand, involved the distance between where the laser dot sat and where the weapon currently pointed. Close that gap and hold the line. Physics would do the rest at 1,100 feet per second. Staff Sergeant Mike Rendina pressed the first charge of tritonal into the barrel cavity using a hydraulic ram that moved at roughly the speed of a man pushing a heavy door shut. Slow, deliberate, constant pressure. Tritonal, a mixture of 80% TNT and 20% aluminum powder, packed denser than pure TNT and detonated with more sustained heat, which mattered enormously when the explosion needed to propagate through a confined underground space rather than dissipate into open air. The aluminum component burned after the initial detonation wave, extending the thermal pulse by milliseconds that translated into catastrophic overpressure inside a sealed bunker. Each barrel accepted its explosive fill in sequential cylindrical blocks, lowered in by hand and seated with the ram. 630 pounds total, divided into segments that fit the bore diameter, with tolerances tight enough that Rendina's team wore cotton gloves to keep skin oils off the mating surfaces. A gap between charged segments meant an air pocket. An air pocket meant uneven detonation. Uneven detonation meant the weapon might break apart during penetration instead of after it, the difference between a bunker killer and an expensive lawn dart. The fusing arrangement reflected Weimorts' obsession with delayed detonation. A standard bomb fuse triggers on impact or within milliseconds of it. The GBU-28 carried an FMU-143 fuse set to a hard delay. The weapon needed to survive impact, travel through 20-plus feet of concrete and earth, reach the interior void of the target structure, and only then detonate. According to the ordnance loading procedures drafted at Eglin, the delay timing remained classified even from most of the assembly crew. Rendina's people packed the explosive and installed the fuse hardware. The specific delay settings arrived separately, hand-carried by a weapons officer who set them at Taif immediately before combat loading. The tail assembly bolted on last. Folding fins that deployed after release, sized larger than standard Paveway fins to compensate for the weapon's abnormal weight. The complete BLU-113 warhead, barrel, nose cone, explosive fill, fuse, then matted to the guidance section in a process that took 2 technicians about 40 minutes per unit. Finished weapons stood upright in their shipping cradles like artillery shells scaled to absurd proportions. The steel casing sweated in the Florida humidity, condensation beating on surfaces that would be bone dry within hours of arriving in the Saudi desert. Rendina's loading crews built the first combat-ready GBU-28s in a total of 9 days. The after-action summary from Eglin's Munitions Directorate uses the word unprecedented 4 times in 11 pages, their word appearing with a frequency that suggests even the authors found the timeline difficult to credit. No weapon in the history of American ordnance had gone from concept to live fire validation faster. The C-141 transport, carrying 2 inert and 2 live GBU-28s, touched down at Tonopah Test Range in Nevada on a morning so cold the ground crew could see their breath pooling around the shipping cradles as forklifts rolled them off the cargo ramp. February in the high desert meant temperatures hovering near freezing at dawn and the steel casings radiated cold through the handler's gloves like iron pulled from a river. The target structure sat 4 miles from the observation bunker. Army engineers had built it months earlier for a different penetration study: stacked concrete slabs reinforced with rebar, layered with compacted earth between each level. The whole assembly simulating a hardened command facility buried under the Iraqi desert. Total depth from surface to the lowest void, roughly 20 feet. Intelligence estimates placed Saddam's deepest bunkers at comparable depths, though some analysts suspected certain facilities ran deeper. Sources conflict on the exact figure Baghdad's engineers achieved. The first F-111F rolled onto its attack heading at medium altitude carrying an inert round. Same weight, same dimensions, same aerodynamic profile, no explosive fill. The weapon fell for approximately 30 seconds. Ground-mounted accelerometers registered the impact as a sharp vertical spike, followed by a sustained low-frequency rumble that lasted nearly 2 full seconds. When the recovery team reached the target, they found the penetrator had punched through every concrete layer and come to rest embedded in the substrate beneath the lowest slab. 22 feet of penetration from a dead piece of steel moving at terminal velocity. The engineers stood at the edge of the crater and looked down. Several of them had spent careers testing air-delivered munitions against hardened targets. The standard 2,000-pound bomb, the workhorse of the Air Force inventory, could penetrate maybe 6 feet of reinforced concrete under ideal conditions. The GBU-28 had tripled that figure on its first attempt, with no warhead aboard, just mass and speed, married to metallurgy tough enough to survive the deceleration forces without cracking. Round 2 carried a live BLU-113 warhead with the FMU-143 fuse set to its operational delay. The F-111F released from the same altitude and profile. Impact looked identical from the observation bunker. A puff of dust, a low seismic thump felt through boot soles at 4 miles. Then the delay expired. The ground above the target heaved upward like something enormous had exhaled beneath it. Concrete slabs weighing several tons each lifted off their foundations and fell back in fragments. A column of dust and pulverized light rose maybe 60 feet before the desert wind caught it and dragged it east. Pressure sensors buried inside the target's lowest chamber recorded overpressure levels that the instrumentation team later described as off-scale. The gauges had been calibrated for conventional weapons, and the GBU-28 exceeded their measurement ceiling. Weimorts received the data by secure phone that evening. The penetration depth matched predictions. The structural kill exceeded them. Every internal void in the target had collapsed completely, leaving nothing but compressed rubble where rooms had been. The weapon performed exactly as the desktop calculations promised it would, which meant either the math had been very good or very lucky. Weimorts, an engineer to his bones, bet on the math. The shipping cradles arrived at Taif Air Base, still dusted with Nevada alkali, white powder streaking the olive-drab wood like salt stains on old boots. Inside each cradle sat a single GBU-28, secured with steel banding that the ground crews cut away using bolt cutters borrowed from the base civil engineering shop. Nobody had written a technical order for handling this weapon. No manual existed. The loadmasters from the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing worked from a 2-page set of handwritten notes faxed from Eglin that morning. February 27, 1991. The ground war had kicked off 3 days earlier, and coalition forces punched through Iraqi defensive lines so fast that the timeline for everything shifted forward. Saddam's command bunkers, the deep ones, the ones Deptula's planners had circled in red weeks ago, remained operational. Iraqi communications traffic still flowed from underground nodes that 5 weeks of conventional bombing hadn't touched. The ceasefire clock ran down by the hour. If the GBU-28 couldn't fly tonight, it might never fly at all. 2 aircraft, 2 weapons. The entire combat inventory of the most powerful conventional penetrator ever built amounted to a pair of converted gun barrels sitting on the tarmac in Saudi Arabia while weapons loaders figured out how to hang them from bomb bay shackles designed for munitions half their weight. The modified mounting hardware had arrived with the cradles, but the fit required adjustment on the flight line. Technicians shimming brackets with aluminum stock, torquing bolts to specifications they calculated on the spot. Master Sergeant Perry Jameson, the lead weapons troop, later noted that his team spent more time on rigging than on any 4 standard combat loads combined. The work took nearly 5 hours per aircraft. Standard weapon loading ran about 90 minutes. Fuel calculations added another constraint. The F-111F could carry the GBU-28, but not the GBU-28 plus a full fuel load plus external tanks. Weight had to come off somewhere. Mission planners stripped the jets to minimum fuel for the outbound leg and scheduled tanker support over northern Saudi Arabia. A KC-135 orbiting at 22,000 feet with enough JP-8 to top off both Aardvarks before they crossed into Iraqi airspace, missed the tanker window and the mission died on the vine. The 2 crews selected for the strike had flown dozens of combat sorties over the previous 5 weeks, all of them at night, all of them at medium altitude into some of the densest air defense networks on the planet. The route and threat rings were familiar ground by now. What they didn't know, what nobody could tell them, involved whether a weapon tested exactly twice in the Nevada desert would perform the same way against a real Iraqi bunker buried under real Iraqi earth. The Tonopah data looked good on paper. Paper doesn't shoot back. 57 days. That's how long separated the first phone call to Weimorts from the moment the lead F-111F banked onto its final attack heading over Al-Taji at 11:42 p.m. local time, February 27, 1991. The aircraft crossed the initial point at 25,000 feet. Wings swept back, the 4,700-pound weapon hanging from jury-rigged shackles that the crew had to trust, because nobody had carried this load before tonight. The weapons systems officer in the right seat acquired the laser spot on the bunker's ventilation shaft, a rectangular patch of concrete barely visible in the infrared display, surrounded by blast walls and revetments that 5 weeks of bombing had chewed into rubble without reaching anything that mattered underneath. He called spot and held the designation steady while the pilot held course, altitude, airspeed. The Paveway 3 guidance head locked onto reflected energy and began feeding corrections to the canard fins. At release, the aircraft lurched upward as nearly 2.5 tons departed the airframe in a fraction of a second. The pilot described the sensation as like somebody cut a cable holding an anvil to my belly. The GBU-28 fell nose down through 25,000 feet of black sky, accelerating past 1,100 feet per second, the laser seeker making continuous adjustments measured in fractions of a degree. What would the Iraqis below have heard? Perhaps nothing. The weapon arrived faster than its own sound. Impact registered on seismic monitors at a coalition observation post 19 miles south. The penetrator struck within 3 feet of the designated aim point, an accuracy figure that Paveway engineers would have called exceptional, even for a standard 2,000-pound bomb, let alone a weapon 3 times heavier, flying for the first time in combat. The hardened steel nose entered the concrete roof at roughly Mach 1.1. Deceleration forces inside the casing peaked at thousands of Gs as the weapon bored through layer after layer. Reinforced concrete, compacted fill, another concrete slab, more earth, another slab. The metallurgy held. Weimorts' gun barrel steel absorbed punishment that would have shattered any conventional bomb casing within the first 6 feet. If the Iraqis had chosen a different reinforcement schedule, more rebar, thicker slabs, deeper burial, the weapon might have stopped short. They didn't. The GBU-28 punched through over 20 feet of hardened structure and detonated inside the command space at the bottom. 630 pounds of tritonal exploded in a sealed concrete chamber. The aluminum powder in the mix burned at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees, consuming available oxygen in milliseconds, while the blast wave reflected off interior walls and amplified with each reflection. Overpressure in that confined space exceeded anything survivable by an order of magnitude. The facility's blast doors, engineered to withstand near misses from conventional bombs, blew inward off their frames. According to post-war damage assessment teams who entered the site weeks later, structural deformation extended outward from the point of detonation through corridors, adjoining rooms, and escape tunnels connected to the main chamber. The assessment report noted complete structural collapse of the primary command level in language, so clinical it almost obscured what had actually happened beneath the desert floor. The second F-111F released its weapon 90 seconds after the first. This round struck a separate entrance to the same complex, penetrating at a shallower angle through a berm-covered access ramp before detonating underground. Between the two weapons, the Al-Taji facility ceased to function as anything other than a tomb. Back at Taif, the two crews landed and taxied to their hardstands without ceremony. Ground crews met them in the dark. The debrief ran short because there wasn't much to discuss. Weapon away, guidance good, impact observed, go home. The 48th's wing commander sent a one-line message to Riyadh confirming both weapons had functioned as designed. Somewhere in the communications chain, that message reached Weimorts at Eglin. The after-action cable from theater to the Pentagon contained a single operational assessment that mattered. Target destroyed, deep structure collapsed, no further strikes required. The ceasefire took effect the following morning at 8 a.m. local time. Less than 9 hours separated the GBU-28's combat debut from the end of the war. The margin between proving the weapon and never using it at all amounted to one night. 8 a.m., February 28th. The guns stopped. Coalition forces held positions across a front stretching from Kuwait City to the Euphrates River Valley. Iraqi units surrendered in numbers that overwhelmed the processing capacity of military police battalions assigned to handle them. Somewhere beneath Al-Taji, dust still hung in corridors that no longer connected to anything. The concrete had not yet finished settling when the order came down to cease offensive operations. Weimorts learned about the ceasefire from a television in the break room at Eglin's munitions development lab. He'd slept maybe 4 hours. The secure phone call confirming weapon function had come in around 2 a.m. Eastern Time, and he'd stayed up running the numbers against the Tonopah baseline data, comparing penetration estimates with the limited battle damage assessment trickling back through classified channels. The preliminary BDA matched. The weapon performed within predicted parameters on its first and only combat employment. An engineering program that began with a legal pad sketch on the second day of January had produced a functional, combat-proven, deep penetration munition before the end of February. 58 days from concept to confirmed kill, the Air Force had 0 remaining GBU-28s in inventory. Both operational rounds detonated under Al-Taji. Both inert test rounds sat in craters at Tonopah. The entire production run, 4 weapons total, 2 of them incapable of exploding, represented the full output of the fastest weapons development program in modern American military history. Had Schwarzkopf delayed the ground offensive by a week, Eglin could have loaded additional barrels and shipped more rounds to theater. Had the ceasefire arrived 12 hours earlier, the F-111Fs would never have launched, and the GBU-28 would exist only as test data from a Nevada desert range. Neither happened. The timing broke exactly right, close enough to make anyone with a sense for probability uncomfortable. The Pentagon's formal after-action review of the GBU-28 program ran to several hundred pages. Buried in the appendices, a cost analysis noted the total expenditure for development, testing, and deployment at approximately $300,000 per weapon. A Tomahawk cruise missile cost roughly $1.4 million. The GBU-28 did what no Tomahawk could do at less than a quarter of the price, using artillery barrels the Army had already written off as scrap. The acquisition community studied that number for years afterward, trying to understand how it happened. They never replicated it. The barrel steel smelled like copper and old grease. Anyone who handled the GBU-28 at Taif remembers that detail. The residual odor of a 105mm howitzer tube that had spent years in storage at Watervliet Arsenal, sweating packing oil into its grain structure, absorbing the particular metallic tang of a building where men had manufactured cannon since 1813. The Army sold those barrels as surplus at roughly $125,000 apiece. That price included the finest weapons-grade steel the American industrial base could produce, already forged, already heat-treated, already stress-tested to tolerances that no bomb casing manufacturer could match at 10 times the cost. $125,000. Adjust for what the Pentagon typically spent on penetrator development, and that number borders on the absurd. The Soviets understood hardened bunkers. They'd built thousands of them across Eastern Europe and Central Asia, poured concrete deep enough to survive anything short of a nuclear weapon, and assumed, correctly, for decades, that NATO lacked a conventional answer. The American response, when it finally came, cost less than a luxury car. It arrived in theater packed in wooden cradles. The guidance kit bolted on with hand tools. The entire weapon could be assembled by 4 enlisted personnel working from handwritten notes in a facility with no climate control, using equipment available at any tactical fighter wing on the planet. Compare that to the B-61 nuclear gravity bomb, which occupied roughly the same strategic niche, killing things buried deep underground, at a unit cost exceeding $28 million and carrying political consequences that made its use functionally impossible in any scenario short of general nuclear war. Or compare it to the later massive ordnance penetrator, the 30,000-pound GBU-57, which entered development in 2004 and didn't achieve initial operational capability until somewhere around 2011. 7 years. The GBU-28 took 58 days. What separated Weimorts' program from everything that came before and after had nothing to do with genius. The technical principles involved, kinetic energy penetration, shaped steel casings, laser guidance, existed in textbooks available to any graduate student at any engineering school in any country with a functioning library. The Soviets, the French, the British, all of them knew the physics. But knowing the physics and building the weapon are different problems separated by an ocean of institutional willpower. And in January of 1991, only one country on Earth possessed both the industrial base to execute and the bureaucratic flexibility to get out of the way long enough for execution to happen. That last part mattered more than the steel. Weimorts bypassed the standard acquisition process entirely. No competitive bidding, no multi-year development contract, no requirements document reviewed by 14 offices across 3 service branches, no environmental impact assessment. He called Watervliet directly. Then the Paveway 3 program office, then Eglin's machine shop. Each call produced a commitment within hours, not months. The program's paper trail, such as it existed, fit in a single file folder. A Defense Science Board review conducted in 1993 attempted to map the GBU-28's acquisition pathway onto the standard Department of Defense procurement flowchart and found that Weimorts had skipped 11 of the 15 mandatory review stages. The report's authors called this irregular. They also noted that the weapon worked. The GBU-28 remains in the active Air Force inventory today, upgraded with GPS, aided guidance, and improved fusing, but still recognizable as the same brute force concept Weimorts sketched on a legal pad 35 years ago. Lockheed Martin manufactures them now in proper factory conditions with proper technical orders and proper quality control documentation. Each round costs considerably more than $125,000. The production timeline runs to months, not weeks. The irregular version punched through Al-Taji's roof at Mach 1.1 and ended an argument about what American engineers could accomplish when someone told them the deadline wasn't negotiable. The regular version fills warehouses. Both work. Only one changed a war overnight. March 15, 1991, 15 days after the ceasefire. Weimorts sat in a windowless conference room at Eglin while a 3-star general from Air Force Systems Command asked him to explain for the official record how he'd built a weapon in 58 days that the normal acquisition process estimated at 36 months. Weimorts pulled out the legal pad, the same one. Still had the original sketch on it, coffee-stained, dimensions scrawled in ballpoint with arrows pointing to the Paveway 3 mating interface. He set it on the table and said nothing for a moment. The general stared at it. According to a colleague present in the room, Weimorts finally spoke. "We didn't have time to do it wrong." The Iraqi engineers who designed the Al-Taji complex had done everything right by the standards available to them. They built to Soviet specifications using French consulting expertise, poured concrete in layers with compacted earth between them, angled the access ramps to deflect blast energy, installed redundant ventilation and communications, hardening that met or exceeded Warsaw Pact standards for strategic command facilities. By any measure available in 1988, when construction finished, they'd built a structure capable of surviving the conventional air campaign that NATO doctrine envisioned. The problem, their problem, arrived 3 years later at Mach 1.1, built from materials that didn't exist as a weapon when their concrete cured. 20 years after Desert Storm, in 2011, the Air Force dropped GBU No. 28s on Libyan underground command facilities during Operation Odyssey Dawn. The weapon performed identically to its debut over Al-Taji. 34 years after Weimorts' legal pad sketch, B-2 Spirit bombers carried upgraded variants of the same penetrator over targets whose locations remain classified. The airframe changed and the guidance evolved. But the steel, Watervliet's steel, Army surplus steel, $125,000 steel, remained at the core of every round. No other weapon in the American arsenal has maintained continuous operational relevance across that span with so few fundamental design changes. The Tomahawk has been redesigned 4 times. The Joint Direct Attack munition went through 3 major block upgrades. The GBU-28 got GPS backup and improved fusing. The casing, the explosive fill weight, the basic aerodynamic profile, all original. Weimorts got it right the first time because he didn't have time to get it wrong. And that constraint produced something the iterative process never matched. Staff Sergeant Rendina left the Air Force in 1994. He took a job with a defense contractor in Central Florida, working quality assurance on precision munitions. A career built, in some sense, on the 9 days he spent pressing tritonal into howitzer barrels with a hydraulic ram, while his hands shook from the cold inside an unheated assembly bay. The pilots from the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing rotated home to RAF Lakenheath in England, flew peacetime training sorties for another decade, retired at various ranks. Their names appear in squadron histories but not in headlines. The weapon systems officers, who held laser designations steady over Al-Taji while anti-aircraft fire rose around them, received air medals. Sources conflict on whether either crew received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation files at Air Force Personnel Center contain gaps for that period. Several months of 48th TFW combat awards remain incompletely digitized. The Iraqi military never rebuilt Al-Taji's deep command level. Satellite imagery from 2003, taken during the lead-up to Operation Iraqi Freedom, showed the surface structures repaired and repurposed, but the underground complex still sealed. 12 years of weathering had partially collapsed the access ramps. Sand filled the blast craters where the GBU-28s entered. Whatever remained below stayed below. Weimorts retired from government service and largely avoided public discussion of the program. He gave a handful of interviews over the years, technical in nature, focused on engineering methodology rather than personal narrative. He deflected credit toward Watervliet's metallurgists, toward the Paveway 3 team at Texas Instruments, toward Rendina's loading crews, toward the machine shop technicians at Eglin, who cut steel and welded fins on a schedule that industrial engineers called physically impossible. In one of his last recorded comments on the subject, given at a munitions symposium in the late 1990s, he addressed the question that everyone kept asking: how he knew the weapon would work without a full test program, without modeling, without the safety net that every other program demanded before committing hardware to combat. He paused long enough that the moderator started to repeat the question. "I didn't know," Weimorts said. "I just knew we'd run out of other options. When you run out of options, the math either works or it doesn't. Ours worked."